Hello the world, hello the internet, hello Jason Isaacs. This is Paul Talks Politics. I'm Paul, and so I should probably start talking politics. Today I'm going to talk about that constitutional reform since 1997. It's been a while since I did one of these videos, and it feels like almost since 1997. Obviously it's not that long, but I do apologise, it's been a while, and I definitely need to get a new video out on constitutional reform, as the last one petered out sometime sort of mid-Cameron. Obviously quite a lot has changed since then. One of the reasons why I haven't got one of these out for a while is because I have been working on a Trump video, and that is tricky because we're talking about a moving target there. So I've been thinking about that. I've also been thinking about constitutional reform. We've had a lot of action on constitutional reform here in the UK since that all started, and I look forward to getting into that right after the introduction. So I'll be back with you in just 1 second. Don't touch that dial. See you shortly. And we're back. Now, as I go through this presentation, we're probably going to refer a few times to this thing down here, which is a fantastic article in The Economist. I'll link off to it, hopefully up there. And this was written just after Cummings was defenestrated, if I remember correctly. Very, very interesting in terms of putting the British Constitution into context and explaining both its strengths and its weaknesses. Now, it can be very confusing both to those who live in this country and to our overseas friends to get our head around the British Constitution, because it is an incredibly complicated idea. So let's get right into that now. And that's quite a memory, isn't it? Now, one of the single most important things about the British Constitution, and perhaps also its most confusing feature, is that we have what's known as a parliamentary system. Now, what this means is that our Constitution isn't written down. It's not codified in a single document. But rather, I think that try to explain that particular detail here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to link off to another video up there where I go into this in much more detail and explain the Constitution and its sources. But the important point to get across right now is that our Constitution is in a constant state of evolution. Our Constitution, within certain specific parameters, specifically within 5 key principles, the rule of law, parliamentary sovereignty, parliamentary government, constitutional monarchy, and the unitary state, within those 5 key parameters, our Constitution is in a constant state of evolution. And the most important way in which we see our Constitution evolving and changing is through statute law. That is, laws that come out of Parliament. And so every time Parliament passes a law, effectively our Constitution changes. That can make it quite hard to stay up with constitutional reform and to identify the things that matter and the things that don't. And so in order to try to make that easier for everybody, I've organised my ideas into 3 specific sections or categories. And here they come. I've done this particular division for 2 reasons. First of all, you have to divide things up if you're going to understand them, and otherwise it's just a massive things that's very, very hard to get your head around. The second thing is that these 3 categories, to me at any rate, seem to make sense. We've got the shape of the state, we've got the way in which the state operates, and the way in which the state relates with the citizens. And the other benefit of this is that for those of you who are doing the EdXL politics course, you'll find that these are the 3 areas that you need to consider when you're looking at comparative politics in component 3. And so getting into this way of thinking early is never a bad thing. So throughout all of this presentation, we're going to be trying to evaluate the significance of constitutional reform in the impact that it has either on the shape and the structure of the institutions of the state, the way in which those institutions work together, or indeed if they don't, and the impact that has on the citizens and the relationship between us, that's you, me, everybody else in this country, and what's happening at the government level, whether that's Parliament, government, or the courts. So that's where this Constitution is going to go. And given that, we should probably move on to have a look at those reforms in detail. And we're going to start off with the Human Rights Act. Okay, so the Human Rights Act, and sorry I'm whizzing around the screen a wee bit. Very, very important that you get your head around this, because it impacts all aspects of the state, the structure, the rational and the cultural. The first thing to say is that we have a codification of the rights. Now, we've always had rights in this country. This didn't really come as a massive surprise. But in came this document, and suddenly what was previously a collection of rights and ideas framed largely in common law became part of the structure of the state, in that they were written out in statute law, and suddenly they achieved a sort of higher level of existence. Now, again, it's codification of rights that we already had in the main, but that brought greater clarity, and most importantly, it limited the range of parliamentary activity. Written into the Human Rights Act was a clause that said that in the future, all of Parliament's legislation would be compatible with, or had to be, compatible with the Human Rights Act. So essentially that limited the scope of parliamentary legislation. Now, it's often thought that this is obviously an infringement on the sovereignty of Parliament, and in the short term, I suppose it is. But Parliament reserves the right to go in and change the Human Rights Act whenever it likes, and so technically sovereignty is retained. Government is also bound to recognise the Human Rights Act, and, well, as is everybody really. And so we have a new set of rights that we can claim against government. And the Human Rights Act also said that the judiciary was responsible for upholding the will of Parliament in the shape of the Human Rights Act. And so whoever infringed the Human Rights Act, whether that was government or indeed Parliament, if Parliament passed a law that was incompatible with the Human Rights Act, then it was incumbent on the judiciary to identify that action, to uphold the will of Parliament. Again, this does not infringe the sovereignty of Parliament, because Parliament has asked the courts on these occasions to identify when it has broken its own rules effectively. The Supreme Court cannot strike down that legislation, but it can identify an incompatibility, issue that famous declaration of incompatibility, when it becomes incumbent on Parliament at some point to change that particular law, to amend that law, to repeal it, and to come up with a better one. So we have structural change, we have rational change, and of course we have cultural change, because now it's easier for us, the citizens, to seek redress of grievance. We can challenge the elective dictatorship. Have a look at that Economist article. I'll link off to that again. And this has led to an increase in litigation for good and for ill. We've seen more judicial review coming through, of which more later. Just wait out for when we get to LASPO. So there we go. The Human Rights Act works on a structural, rational and cultural level, and is always going to be useful. You're going to be writing about this in your essays, whether you like it or not. So I suggest you get your heads around it. And yeah, we'll leave it out there, and we'll move on to devolution. Okay, so on to devolution. And one of the interesting things about devolution is that it's a big topic, so big it could legitimately be asked as a question in its own right. And you may find at that point that this structural, rational, cultural matrix helps you significantly, because, have we had structural change? Yes, we've had massive structural change. We've got new institutions. We've got new electoral systems. Both of those are structural changes brought about by devolution, and you can evaluate the way in which those outcomes have been distributed equitably, or indeed, in the case of England, not distributed at all. In terms of rationality, the magic word there is always going to be subsidiarity. The idea that local solutions require local problems. Why should London be legislating for Scotland if it can be done in Edinburgh? Why should London be legislating for Wales if it can be done in Cardiff and Northern Ireland? All of these different points. That's the concept of subsidiarity, and it's a very, very important one to get your head around. Parliamentary sovereignty is something that often comes up at this point as well. The idea being, has devolution destroyed parliamentary sovereignty? Well, it hasn't. Because, as we've seen in Northern Ireland, whatever Parliament giveth, Parliament taketh away. And on a number of occasions, rule from Westminster has been re-established over Northern Ireland for a number of reasons that I explore in more detail in my devolution video. The key point, as ever, with Parliament is parliamentary sovereignty means that whatever Parliament giveth, Parliament can taketh away. And while it might de facto be very, very difficult to unwind devolution in Scotland, de jure, these laws could be reversed, because no Parliament cannot make a law that a future Parliament cannot get rid of. So that's the rational side of things, and I think hopefully that's fairly clear. Cultural is really interesting, and this is why this particular structural rational cultural model can really, really help when it comes to talking about things like devolution, because you can say, well, in the cultural round, what has it done? Well, it's enhanced democracy is significant. We've got more levels of democracy, but of course that's not distributed equitably because Britain doesn't have its own assembly. We've got the rather ad hoc distribution of metropolitan mayors, and problems still remain. We have all of that devolution, but Scottish MPs can still vote on English laws, while Westminster cannot pass legislation about education in Scotland or agriculture in Scotland. MPs in Scotland can still vote on agriculture and education in the UK, as the Education Act of 2004, I'm pretty sure it was, demonstrated. So devolution is a key aspect of parliamentary reform that demonstrates the strengths of the strengths of the system, in that we can devolve very quickly, relatively easily, but also bad because it doesn't mean that there has to be any sort of organizational system. One of the great things, or one of the big problems with devolution, is that it is a whopping great bodge. The Labour government was making it up as it went along, and because you can just reform the constitution through simple passage of law, there's no special procedures to apply to this. So these assemblies were created in the regions, but there was no central authority designed to help them coordinate activities if something terrible happened, like a plague. When COVID came around, there was no central authority that was able to coordinate the health response of the various different regions. Similarly, when Brexit happened, there was no institution in the middle who could help the regions deal with it. It was all sort of defaulted to Westminster, and of course Westminster post-Brexit had its own problems to deal with. So with devolution, you can see, yes, we can create constitutional reform easily. Perhaps we can create it too easily, and we can legislate and make it up as we go along without necessarily having an overall plan, because when you can reform your constitution by simply passing law, the temptation is to pass law because it's easy to do. Check my video on devolution for more detail there. On to the House of Lords, and perhaps here the situation is a little clearer in that it's probably a good thing. We've got structural, rational and cultural change, as I lay out on those particular videos, on that particular slide even. In terms of cultural change, has it made the House of Lords more assertive? It's certainly given them more confidence to tackle government, in that they have more enhanced legitimacy, but obviously they haven't really got any more power. And as we've seen in legislation left, right and centre, the government can still overrule the House of Lords if it really wants to. Let's think about the Safety of Rwanda Asylum and Immigration Bill 2024. But at the same time, the House of Lords has been instrumental in slowing down some, and in some instances, straight up stopping some of the more egregious elements of particularly the Blair reform, the introduction of ID cards in 2004, 2006, the Leg Reg Bill 2006. We've seen the House of Lords definitely saying, hang on, are you sure this is a good idea? And are they doing that more than they were before the House of Lords reform? I'm sure someone's done some work on that, but we're certainly seeing more opportunities for patronage and even fundraising, as Tony Blair's loans for lordship scandal demonstrated. But there we go. That's the House of Lords Act. Significant, perhaps more structural than anything else. It didn't really move the dial culturally or indeed rationally, but an important step forward towards making Parliament more democratic. Speaking of which, I think the same is very much true of the Constitutional Reform Act. It's easy to get excited about the Constitutional Reform Act because it created a Supreme Court, and it enhanced independence and neutrality of our judiciary. But did it really? We always had a Supreme Court. Our judiciary was always independent. Our judiciary has always been neutral. Now, the Supreme Court when it was in the House of Lords, was simply the House of Lords sitting in judicial function as the final court of appeal. But we always had a court at the top. But what the Constitutional Reform Act did that was extremely effective or extremely useful was to codify practices that were already there. We already had an independent judiciary. We already had a neutral judiciary. What the Constitutional Reform Act was to take those ideas or those principles and give them a statutory footing. In terms of the structural elements of it, well, we had a new building. We have a new independent Supreme Court, and we see the Lord Chancellor being stripped of a lot of his powers. You could possibly argue that the Judicial Appointments Commission comes into the structural thing, but I think that's more important in terms of the rational element, whereby we see we see greater effort being made to assert judicial neutrality and with that judicial independence. Culturally, again, not really moving the needle particularly, because our judiciary has always been independent, and it's always been neutral, or it's always been getting more independent and more neutral as time passes. There are still elements that are perhaps a little concerning. The idea of the benefit of the doubt, which always seems to accrue to institutions, to government, to democratic institutions, whether that's the government or the or Parliament. But I don't want to go into that right now. You can check my video on the judiciary for more details, and I will link off to that somewhere sensible. There was a thought that the Judicial Review and Courts Bill was going to be a big issue because Johnson was getting so much grief from the courts because he kept breaking the law. If Johnson hadn't been breaking the law, then he wouldn't have been getting that grief from the courts, but he was, and so he did. He was going to pass they did eventually pass the Judicial Review and Courts Bill. But because by that stage we pretty much got rid of Johnson, the bill didn't need the teeth that it really wanted, or that Johnson previously had demanded. So the Judicial Review and Courts Bill, not massively significant. Judicial Reform and Judicial Review and Courts Act, again, bit of a paper tiger when it came through, so not hugely significant. Perhaps more significant are some critical reforms to the royal prerogative that we'll look at in the next slide. So you might argue that this is a bit niche, and well, it is, but this is Paul Talks Politics, and so what exactly did you expect? Structural, rational and cultural reforms. We're coming now to the idea that Parliament should vote before any deployment of the military. That is a structural thing. That is now a limit to the exercise of the prerogative power. It's a new constitutional convention. We haven't had one of those for a long time. And it is a theoretical limit to government power, de jure or de facto, one for you to ponder. This all came about because Tony Blair asked Parliament 3 times whether or not it was a good idea to invade Iraq. What do you know? 3 times Parliament said it was, although with a declining majority on each of those occasions. But this gave Parliament, or specifically, the House of Commons, some teeth. And so when David Cameron went to the House of Commons in 2013 and asked for permission to put troops on the ground in Syria, the Commons said no. Now, this was a very, very interesting point because it's one of the odd occasions when the coalition really seems to have had some teeth or some real influence. And the coalition here essentially break down because the coalition. This was a very interesting instance where the coalition actually seemed to develop some teeth. And the coalition broke down because this wasn't really part of the deal. And so when Cameron went to Parliament and said, can I put troops on the ground in Syria? He didn't quite get the answer he was expecting. Now, not only did this cheese him off massively, it very much upset Barack Obama, who realised that after that, taking any request for military action to Congress was likely to fail. And so, he never forgave Cameron for that. So yeah, that was a check on parliamentary on government power. However, in 2018, in Syria again, when May decided to launch attacks on various sites with cruise missiles, if I remember correctly, the missiles were launched on Friday, and she sought retrospective permission from Parliament on the Monday, or specifically again the House of Commons. I got to get that one right. I do apologise. Now, on this occasion, that retrospective permission was granted, even though it's quite clearly taking the mick. The compliant majority kicked in again. Parliament could have done something at that point, but you can't really pull those missiles out of the ground. The argument was that it was a surprise attack, and any vote in Parliament would have warned the Syrians that this was coming, which kind of makes sense until you remember that she told the Russians that it was going to happen so they could move their planes out of the way. So when the missiles fell, we didn't accidentally damage any Russian warplanes, because let's face it, that would be awkward. So we have got a structural thing here. We've got a new constitutional convention. We've got a rational thing here. We've got a limit to government power. But in reality, has it really moved the needle? Well, we've got a compliant majority in the House of Commons, so most of the time anyway. So is the Commons likely suddenly to develop a conscience and teeth? Well, you can be the decider of the arbiter of that. And that kind of moves into another aspect of constitutional reform. The Wright reforms. Great in principle, the idea being giving Parliament its dignity back, enabling Parliament to stand up to government. And so we got the backbench business committee. So the backbench business committee, we got internal elections for committee chairs, and we got e-petitions, and that's all really, really nice. But the idea that the government is ever going to allow Parliament to become strong enough to challenge it is frankly nonsense. And that's kind of what we saw. The backbench business committee, it has some influence. E-petitions can be interesting. And select committees chairs have become more independent. But again, select committees have always been kind of independent because it rather suits the government that they should be so. That's a whole different argument. Look at my video on select committees. I'll try to remember to link off to that one in the fullness of time. I think one of the key things about the Wright Committee report was that, particularly if you read Chris Mullin's diaries, he was a huge fan of the committee's work, and he really hoped that when the government took those proposals on board that Parliament might get some teeth and again have its dignity restored. But that just didn't happen, and he was particularly scathing in his diaries about the way in which the heart was ripped out of the Wright report. So again, this is one of the cultural elements, is that it was cosmetic. This is performative, and did it make things better? I suppose so. Has it fundamentally tipped the needle and restored dignity to Parliament and made Parliament better able to stand up to an overmighty executive? Well, the years since then have demonstrated that I'm afraid it's not. And perhaps nowhere is that more evident than in the Fixed Term Parliament Act of 2011. So again, we see a structural reform. We have the introduction of a fixed, apparently, 5-year timetable and a 2/3 threshold for any confidence motion. In theory, that restricts government power in that they are now tied to a formal timetable. But anyone with a passing understanding of the history of 2011 will know that that's not what happened. May called a confidence motion in 2017 and essentially called time on her own Parliament so she could enhance her majority. Can't quite remember how that finished, but I seem to remember it wasn't particularly well. Johnson tried to pull the same stunt, and he couldn't get a 2/3 majority to trigger that early election, and so he simply passed a bill. He passed the early parliamentary general election of 2019 because that only requires a 50% threshold, and that basically said we're going to waive the Fixed Term Parliament Act and have an election in 2019. You really, really, really couldn't make it up. And then that was repealed, of course, by the Dissolution and Calling of Parliament Act in 2022. Whoops, sorry about that. And that restored government discretion over the Parliament election schedule. And essentially this just demonstrates strengths and weaknesses of the British system. We have a good idea. We're going to tie government into a fixed 5-year schedule so that policies can't be fixed to the election, and so the government can't suddenly decide to have an election suddenly after a bit of good news. And then what do you know? Government finds out that that doesn't help it. It doesn't work to its advantage. And so it triggers it triggers an early election through a 2/3 majority vote, or if that fails, it just passes a bill saying we're going to have an emergency early election, and eventually they say, look, this is just rubbish, this is just too hard for us, let's get rid of it with the Dissolution and Calling of Parliament Act of 2022. A constitution that's too easy to reform can mean that we go through silly little routines like this that essentially just seem to waste everybody's time. Oh well, it was nice while it lasted. So, after something that was a bit of a joke, let's get on to something that was really a lot more serious. Even if on the face of it seems a lot more innocuous. The Legal Aid, Sentencing and Punishment of Offenders Act had many different aspects of legislative reform within it. The one I'm interested in are the changes to legal aid. Now, previously, in order to qualify for legal aid, you had a threshold that, let's say for the sake of argument, it was about there. So if your income was above that level, you would have to fund any legal contest yourself. If it was below that level, then you would qualify for legal aid. Now, where was that level? Well, let's just say teachers would probably qualify for legal aid. What LASPO did was it said there are far too many people out there getting legal aid who don't want it, who don't need it, and too many unscrupulous lawyers who are exploiting this to file frivolous or vexatious claims, which is clogging up the courts and wasting taxpayers' money. Now, were some lawyers filing vexatious and frivolous claims and wasting taxpayers' money? Yes, they were. Okay, we fully accept that. However, the reform initiated here by Chris Grayling in the interests of saving money and saving time by cutting or limiting access to legal aid has been utterly catastrophic. This has reduced access to legal aid, and the courts are still an absolute mess. So I don't want to go into the details here because it's really outside my area of expertise. I will direct anyone who is interested in this towards the secret barrister who goes into this, and other elements, by the way, who go into this in much more detail. But this is so important, because if you look at my videos on the courts and I say, look, the great thing about the courts is that they're neutral and they are independent, because they are neutral and they are independent. Okay, in terms of neutrality, there is a sort of benefit of the doubt that accrues to democratic elected officials, because the courts reckon, look, this is what the people asked for, presumably this is what the people want then, and they recognize that they don't have the authority to overrule people who've actually won elections. The Americans might want to look at this from time to time. And the judiciary is independent. There's no point trying to argue that they're not. Although if you've watched the Lockerbie documentary, you might have something to say about that. The key point is, it doesn't matter if you've got a neutral and an independent judiciary if you don't have access to justice. So it's rather like this way. There's nothing stopping me from buying a Ferrari. I can go into a Ferrari dealership and I can look at them and I can ask questions about it, and I can maybe even take one for a test drive. But when it comes to me buying one, that simply ain't going to happen because I can't afford it. Similarly, I might have a neutral and an independent judiciary, but that doesn't help me at all if I can't take my case to court. Now, what has happened here is that this has led to two things. It's led to a significant decrease in the number of cases that are being filed, and many of those that still are being filed are basically litigant prosecutors. So in other words, the individual who is taking the case represents themselves. And there's an old adage in law, I believe it is, that whoever represents themselves has a fool for a client. Those figures there are from the government. I'll just move that thing over there. This is another great report. Every now and again, a select committee produces a fantastic report. This one is a joint select committee, so we don't have these ones coming up very often. And I think it's fairly clear to see that what we've seen since LASPO is a dramatic decrease in the number of cases that are being filed. Now, are those, or were some of those vexatious? Possibly. But some of them will have been valid claims. And it's worth looking at the way in which, the number of applicants or the number of cases that have started have fallen dramatically, but so have the ones that have actually gone to trial. And that's the critical thing. These reforms have restricted people's access to justice, and certainly for my tuppence, that's a bad thing. And restricting the ability of people to hold their government to account through the courts, if they can't get redress from the parliament, and let's face it, with the compliant majority, that ain't going to happen. So most people wind up who have a genuine grievance against the courts, against the government, will seek that redress through judicial review. But now the only way you can do it is if you're incredibly rich, in which case you're probably not going to need judicial review, or if you're incredibly poor, which means that at least those people are going to be catered for. Those in the middle, that sort of middle income group, now have to either remortgage the house or represent themselves, and neither of those is guaranteed to generate a particularly good outcome. So that's LASPO, and it's a very, very important bit of constitutional reform that a lot of people just skip over. Perhaps its biggest importance, however, is if you're looking at the relationships between the branches and the way in which people can access the courts to seek redress of grievance, and this is limiting access to those courts. Again, we can see quite clearly that many more cases are opened than actually go to court, but that drop down there is significant because some of those are going to be good cases that are no longer happening, and everybody should have the right to access. It's rather like a snowplow or a parachute. You hope never to have to use it, but when you do, you really, really, really hope it works. That's what the court systems work like. That's what the court system is in the UK, and the concern is that it's not working. Certainly not working for everybody as well as it should. Okay, let's move on to something that's a bit better, and we're looking now at the Same-Sex Couples Act of 2013. There you go. I don't really need to explain any of that, but it's fairly clear that we've got structural, rational, and cultural reform, and I genuinely hope that everybody I'm talking to out there recognises that this is a good thing. I think the real value, or the real capital in this particular exercise is contrasting it with the United States, where we talk about how we can reform our constitution easily. Look at how much of an issue this has proven to be in the United States. At present, at time of going to press in 2025 with Obergefell versus Hodges, this is still settled law. By the time people are watching this video in 2 or 3 years' time, if people indeed are, I wonder where it's going to be. But there we go. So, after something that's fairly, hopefully, innocuous, onto something that's perhaps a little more contentious. Let's try to stay out of the arguments here and just focus on the big issues. Structurally, well, huge. I mean, we were in the EU, we are now out of the EU. That is a big structural change, and with that came massive rational change. The way in which the government works is different. The way in which Parliament works is different. And the way in which the courts work. All of these are changed dramatically. Excuse me. I think the big issue here is that Brexit was supposed to bring cultural relief. The idea was we would be free of our European overlords, free to become the raging economic powerhouse of an independent, autonomous area. Well, maybe that's work in progress. Maybe that's coming through. But as it stands, again, at time of going to press, Remainers are still moaning. The blessed uplands of post-Brexit, Britain still seem as remote as ever. We've got strains on devolution. Scotland and Northern Ireland voted Remain. Wales voted out. And of course, the Northern Ireland Protocol, that hard border in Northern Ireland remains an utter mess. So, yeah, constitutional reform, somewhat problematic. And I really don't want to say much more about Brexit at this point other than, yeah, we'll wait and see, shall we? But significant structural, rational and cultural reform. Another bit of reform that's worth knowing about, skeleton acts. We're seeing more and more of these acts. The first one I remember coming across was the Ripper in 2000, but since then we've seen a huge range of them, all the way up to and including COVID of 2020. There are many, many others out there which are no less important. Okay, I've been visited here. You've all in the past met Poppy the political dachshund. Well, this is Cleo the constitutional cat. Say hello, Cleo, and go away. The thing about skeleton acts is that it makes Parliament's job simultaneously easier and difficult. Parliament doesn't have to worry about passing these bills. The government can run things through regulation, which is great. But sometimes Parliament does need to check what government is doing. In the main, these acts can be innocuous, but as we saw with COVID, sometimes they can be very, very serious indeed. But again, we're looking at the way in which power seems to shift from the legislature to the executive to shape the civil state. You should not be reshaping the civil state with a regulation or with a statutory instrument. Shaping the civil state should be the job of Parliament. We voted for Parliament. The government should not be shaping the civil state with regulations. The Ripper, maybe, maybe not. COVID definitely did, arguably, justifiably. We're in the middle of a raging pandemic. But watch it, because these are coming more and more often, because they are easier for government to, there are easier vehicles through which the government can impose its agenda. Police Crime and Sentencing Courts Act, again, we're seeing a particular bit of power shift here. I'm going to move myself again over in this direction. This is pretty much this generation's SOCPA, expansion of state control, making it easier for the government to manage protests. They're never going to make it easier for protesters, really. But we're seeing restrictions on civil liberties, enhanced powers of the state, and really just, again, expanding state authority. And this is the last one, and many interesting little things here. The Dissolution and Calling of Parliament Act, I mentioned this one earlier. It repealed the Fixed Term Parliament Act. The rational bits are interesting in that this was passed in the wake of Miller 2, and in passing it, Johnson included a particular clause saying that the prerogative powers are no longer challengeable in court, the non-justiciability of prerogative powers, which you would only do if you were planning to prorogue Parliament again indefinitely in the future. And yeah, anyway, that one got through. Cultural change, limiting the ability of the government to hold, of the courts to hold government account. And yeah, that's it. You're up to date with significant constitutional reform since 1997. Remember, structural, rational and cultural is just a way of organising these ideas and trying to make sure that you're coming at it from three significantly different perspectives to each element of constitutional review. I'm pretty sure that we haven't had anything of this magnitude since we got rid of the last lot. You could talk about the Illegal Migration Act. You could talk about the Safety of Rwanda Act, but I've probably talked enough about those, for goodness sake. So we'll leave it there. Anyway, if you've made it this far, thank you very much. Like and subscribe. Tell your friends, and do please let me know if there's anything else that you would like me to cover in these videos, or indeed if you've got any comments or questions arising from this one. This video is long enough already. I'm going to let you go. Thanks for your time. I'm Paul Talks Politics, and I'll see you next time when we come back to talk about some more politics. Take care now. Bye.